Hello, my name is Danielle Milam, and I'm doing my case study 2 presentation on the international trade of reptiles and CITES. So a brief introduction to reptiles is that they belong to the group Animalia. They are vertebrates. They're typically covered in scales because they are cold-blooded, and therefore it is quite difficult for them to maintain their own body temperature. They typically produce shelled eggs, or they can give birth. All of the species that I looked at in my study in particular do lay eggs and fertilize those eggs internally, and they have at least one lung. So now let's get into some graphs on this trade. I think the graphs are pretty interesting because they show kind of a discrepancy between the information that we know in terms of importing and exporting. So the global import and export graph actually shows, interestingly enough, between the years 2017 and 2018, that the trade reported by exporters is kind of a little bit lower than what is being reported by importers, which suggests that maybe those countries that are exporting it are not doing it correctly, or there might be some smuggling involved where the species aren't being reported that they're being traded, but other countries are reporting that they have been received. Here on the national export graph for the US, we kind of see a similar thing where we're reporting our exports a little bit more than we're reporting our imports, but this is seen even more on the national import graph, where there is a huge discrepancy of the imports that are being reported versus the exports that are being reported. So the first species that I looked at with Appendix 1 in CITES is the Union Island gecko. The scientific name is Gonatodes duandi. The current status, according to the ICUN, is critically endangered, and that is from statistics from 2019, and they remain critically endangered today. Their range, interestingly enough, the Union Island gecko is actually confined to the island of St. Vincent and the Grenadines. So they have a really small range being confined to just that one island. There's only one population of the species. So within that island, they have an occurrence of 1 kilometer. However, the suitable habitat for them is only 0.53 of a kilometer. So that has to suggest that their habitat is kind of dwindling within their overall range. Some general information is that the species was actually discovered in 2005. So they are a fairly relatively new, if we can call it that, species where we don't know a whole lot about them yet. We haven't done a lot of research about them. Their physical features, as you can see with this little guy on the screen, are very, very distinct. No other reptile has the markings that the Union Island gecko has that we know of. So as you can see, they have that pointed snout. They have bright red or orange eyes. You can see that underneath the spots, they're kind of more camouflaged with some greens, some browns, maybe some black scales. But the real highlight of the species is the little target-like areas along the Union Island gecko's back, where it's that white spot surrounded by a black spot, surrounded by then a red or an orange spot. And another interesting thing about the Union Island gecko is that they're quite small. They only grow to be about 3 centimeters from their snout to the base of their tail, which makes them weigh less considerably. They're only 0.56 of a gram. And their habitat, remember, they're confined to that one section of that island, and there's only one population of them. So they really rely on the forest and rocky areas of that kind of beachy, sandy island. So they really like to live there where they can really burrow and hide within the trees with that great camouflage that they have. And it's also interesting that though we don't know a lot about their feeding, we do know that they're insectivorous. So they're only going to eat crickets, flies, beetles, and they'll eat other small invertebrates as well. And we don't know a lot about their breeding either. We've been able to see a little bit in captivity, but because we haven't had a lot of time to research them out in nature and because of the threats that are posed to them, it's a lot harder to study. But we do know that, or we think we know, that they lay eggs several times a year, and those clutches are pretty small, usually only 1 to 2 to 3 kind of eggs. So some economic and trade value. The biggest issue facing the Union Island gecko in terms of trading is that they are kind of used for the international pet trade. And smuggling has really taken a toll on the species. So between 2010 and 2018, the density within their range shrunk by 80%, which is kind of a lot and probably lends to them being critically endangered. Their value is most likely for their size. Remember, they only get to be about 3 centimeters base to tail, and because they have those very distinct markings that, again, no other reptile that we know of has. A majority of these sales are going to the US and EU that we know about. Again, the graphs that we looked at earlier kind of get a little bit confusing, kind of get a little bit funky in terms of how much of this trade is actually being reported. And there are some reports of captive breeding, and this just makes it all the more confusing and difficult to research the species in the wild because we're kind of relying on captivity. And there is, and I've read plenty of research on this and don't actually know why, and most of the researchers actually don't know why, but there is a bias to having males in captivity versus females. And a little bit on how to regulate the trade or conservation measures is that the St. Vincent and the Grenadines Wildlife Protection Act of 1987 should be protecting the species, but it's a little bit more complicated. So in that act, it essentially lays out that, or makes it illegal for people to smuggle species out of this island. However, that's very difficult to manage, especially with a species that is so small, and a species that we don't know a lot about. Smuggling is not, however, the only issue. In 2005, remember that's the year that they were found or discovered, there was road construction going through the island, which kind of took a toll on some of their habitat. They are threatened by several different forms of invasive species that kind of prey on them. And because there is such little research on the species, it really is kind of hard to know how to monitor them, know how to best protect them. A lot more research is going to have to be done. The forestry department of this island and some non-government organizations have appointed wardens to try and protect the species, but there's just not the necessary resources to really have done that successfully, unfortunately. And there is no protection from international legislation as of yet for the species, other than monitoring by CITES. So in the second appendix, I looked at the tokay gecko. The scientific name is actually gecko gecko. The current status has not been evaluated by or for the IUCN Red List, which is pretty interesting. Their range, the natural range that they have is from Northeast India to the Indo-Australian archipelago. And what's interesting about this is their range has changed drastically, not because of the wild, but because of the amount of people that have smuggled the species out, set them loose in other areas, that have kept them for pets all around the world. So it kind of makes them appear like they're more common than they are. Some general information on the species is that they actually have small ears on either side of their head. They have large eyes, and they have a remnant of a third eye on their head, which is pretty interesting. They're typically green to gray, as you can see in this picture of this little guy right here. They have those little red spots that are kind of distinctive to them, and males are typically more brightly colored than females. And this is one of the largest geckos alive today at about 35 centimeters. Their native habitat is the rainforest biome or a boreal forest. They feed, again, like the last species that we looked at, on insects, they are insectivores. They feed on small invertebrates, and more is known about what they eat in captivity, unfortunately, than the wild. So they'll often be fed pests like locusts, which kind of draws some people to own them. In captivity, they will also eat crickets and cockroaches. And their breeding is pretty interesting. So they have 4 to 5 month breeding seasons and lay eggs to solid foundations where the parents will typically guard them. But the thing that I found the most interesting was that the parents will guard them, but also might eat the eggs potentially, which seems a little bit counterintuitive, but they know best. And they typically lay clutches of 2 eggs. So their economic trade and value was quite interesting. They're really big in the pet trade, like the Union Island gecko was. They have decreased in population while increasing in demand, and the biggest country kind of demanding them right now is China. It's difficult to tell between wild and captive bred of the species. One interesting statistic that I kind of found was Indonesia permitted the trade of 3 million, quote, captive bred of the species. However, because that's such a large number, and because we can't really tell which ones are captive and which ones were found in the wild, that's a little bit questionable. They're also used for medicinal purposes. They can be used sometimes for like ancient or cultural type medicines. And they're also thought to cure serious illnesses like HIV or AIDS. And there's been some studies on using freeze-dried specimen to try and combat cancer. In parts of Southeast Asia, they're often thought to bring good luck and fertility. They're traded in Vietnam for their meat. And we have been warned by CITES that the populations in one of their native areas of India has been overharvested. And if nothing is improved, the species may soon become endangered, according to CITES. So a little bit on how to regulate the trade or conservation measures is that we really need to monitor that trade data. Promotion of the collection of data on different populations would be super helpful in doing that, because that might help us get to that key of discerning what is wild and what is captive bred. Again, that can kind of mess up statistics oftentimes and makes it harder for CITES to make sure that these species are being handled properly. As of now, no conservation management is done by the native countries of these species, unfortunately, but hopefully monitoring by CITES will help them. And for appendix number 3, I looked at the Cuban broad-banded sparrow. As you can see that little guy down there, he's pretty interesting looking. The scientific name for the species is the Sphaerodactylus torei, and there's 2 subspecies, the Sphaerodactylus torei and the Sphaerodactylus torei spelmani. The current status for the species is endangered. They are confined to one small area, much like the Union Island gecko. They're one small area of southeast Cuba. Both the subspecies are kind of separated by geographic factors. So the Sphaerodactylus torei is found in the city, actually, of Santiago de Cuba, and the Sphaerodactylus torei spelmani is found in the Guantanamo province. So some general information, physical features, as you can tell, they kind of vary in color. I know you can see towards the middle, they kind of go from light to maybe like a orangey kind of color back to like a gray, and they're really known for those thick black, and sometimes they can be brown strips along the body of the species, which is pretty interesting. And those strips can actually fade as the specimen grows older. They grow to be about 38 to 39 millimeters, so they are quite small as well. And females are often smaller than the males. The Sphaerodactylus torei lives in an arid coastal forest around the city of Santiago de Cuba. And it's interesting and kind of unfortunate that the species has really had to adapt to city living. So now they can often be found in the cracks of architecture, on walls, and oftentimes in dumps, basically, and trash, because they have had to adapt to this kind of city living because people have taken over their native habitats. The Sphaerodactylus torei spelmani have a much more kind of traditional life for the species. They live in an open xeric forest and aren't really, as of now, having to adjust to that city life. Feeding, they are also insectivores. They like small vertebrates like flies and crickets that we know of. And for breeding, there's not much known because it is difficult for one of the subspecies living in the city for them to find proper places to lay their eggs, which is kind of harming them and maybe lending to that status of endangered. And they typically only lay several eggs per year, which also doesn't help. So their economic and trade value, they too are very popular in the pet trading. And as you can see over here, this is just another picture of how they can vary in their coloration. So a lot of people, I assume, would find it interesting because they do come in quite distinctive and varied markings. Another issue facing them is the timber cropping industry going on right now in Cuba is really affecting the Spilmani subspecies. It's not adapting to the cities quite as well as the other subspecies is. So as its forest and natural habitat are disappearing, it's having a harder time finding suitable areas to live. How to regulate trade or conservation measures. There's no known species-specific conservation measure in place by the country that they are found in. The distribution does coincide with the Reserva de la Biosfera, Bocano, and Reserva Natural Hatibonico. I apologize for my pronunciation, but kind of coming in to that protective area, having their range as part of that protective area does offer them a little bit more protection and monitoring. However, they specifically are not protected and monitored within their native region. Recommendation of more research on the population has been made. This having to do with trends on the population as a whole, some threats to them, their ecology, distribution of the species, and an increased species population monitoring just to kind of tell why they're kind of disappearing and why they have that endangered status and what can be done for them. So my conclusion, I learned a lot of things while doing this. I found CITES a really interesting thing to research, as well as these species that belong to it. So I learned that biodiversity is at the center of all the species that I examined. And I just happened to pick different kinds of gecko, but the thing that really drew me to them was their coloration was often quite unique. And I assume that's the same for people that are smuggling them or people that are buying them illegally through that international pet trade. They're really prized for their aesthetic value. And it's unfortunate that they just are typically harmed by it. I learned that CITES has the potential to save species even when legal measures fail or are non-existent. So as we looked at in the Union Island gecko, there were ways to preserve that species, but it just couldn't be carried out properly, and that really harmed the species. So it's really great to have things like CITES to keep track of the data and to try to understand why species are struggling and what can be done for them. And with all of these species, trade was kind of the main thing that was really harming them. So having something to monitor that trading was really helpful. I also learned that a tighter control on these species is a necessity. So a lot of them are starting to disappear, again, because of that trade, because of that smuggling. And there's also instances of habitat destruction. And in the last species that we looked at in Cuba, for both of the subspecies, they have been forced to adapt to city living because of the destruction of their habitats. And as we can recall, one of them did adjust better than others. And that really made kind of this discrepancy and really harmed that species. So it's really important to get a better control over how we are affecting these species and how we can better them instead of just ruining their habitat and kind of ignoring them in a way, unfortunately. And I also learned that more research on these species is essential for their preservation. During a lot of my research, I was having a really hard time finding current research. Other than the Union Island gecko, because it was discovered in 2005, that didn't have a lot of research because it was so new, but the other two species, a lot of the research was from the early 1900s and it just wasn't current and it was very incomplete. And I found it very hard to understand how we could potentially protect these species better, not knowing much about them. It just is not practical. And so I think that more research is definitely a necessity for these species. Here are my references, and thank you for watching. If you have any questions, please let me know.